This is genius.
Wow. That was the reaction of David Howell and Lawrence Trent when they witnessed Magnus Carlsen's stunning piece sacrifice played against Fabiano Caruana in the World Blitz Championship 22. Now, this incredible game had 3 key turning points that we can all learn a lot from. So let's check this one out. Fabi kicks off here with pawn to e4. We had e5 from Magnus, knight f3, knight c6, and now bishop b5, the Roy Lopez or Spanish game. Magnus kicks that bishop. We don't see an exchange variation. Fabi drops back. And now knight f6 develops. We see castles, bishop e7, standard opening theory here. And now rook e1 defends this pawn. And so now there's truly a threat to eliminate the knight and win a pawn. So b5 breaks the pin. The bishop drops back. Magnus now castles, and this is a very standard position here where if white goes pawn to c3, the main move, then black can go d5, the so-called Marshall gambit. You gambit this pawn on e5, and black's been shown to kind of equalize very comfortably. So instead we see d3. Other tries there too, like pawn h3, etc. Magnus now goes pawn to d6, and now that he's protected this pawn with another one, there's actually a threat here to go knight a5 and win this bishop. Now the standard response is pawn c3, supports d4, allows the bishop to tuck back, but Fabi goes bishop to d2, a sideline, and David Howell mentioned that Fabi had actually come up with this move. So the knight can't come to a5, so Magnus just goes pawn h6. Standard move in these structures. Fabi does the same, and now rook e8, multi-purpose developing move, which I'll talk a bit more on in a moment. But first we see Fabi here going pawn a3. You can also go pawn a4 there, excuse me. Pawn a4 already starting to nibble away at this chain on the queen side, but Fabi just goes for a slightly slower approach. These positions are very subtle, very cat and mouse. The top GMs love them. And now bishop f8 from Magnus. So this is what I was talking about, this being a multi-purpose move. With the rook now having its eyes opened, with the bishop retreating, it supports bishop e6, which Magnus soon plays, but also it supports this e5 pawn along with the knight, so d5 starts to become a very real possibility for black, and if you can achieve that, you're usually equalising if you can do it in the right circumstances. Knight c3 from Fabi, he clamps on that move for now. And now rook b8 from Magnus, he comes off that a file, and now knight d5, we see a pair of pieces exchanged, and here we see the bishop recaptures. Best move, keeps the pawn structure intact, keeps this diagonal open for the bishop. Magnus drops back with the knight, it was attacked, hits this bishop, and then he hops into g6. Very standard remaneuver, still supports the pawn from here, also looks in this direction, plus the c-pawn is now free to move, it wasn't before. And now we see a4 from Fabi, and he could have done that in one move earlier, but okay, he now does it now, nibbling away at the queenside pawns, and the computer actually wants to go b4 here, keep the a-file closed, that's its favourite move, but Magnus instead goes for bishop to e6. He trades off this powerful piece, rook recaptures, he allows this exchange, and now Fabi doesn't quite capitalise on this as best as he could. So he goes queen e2, but it's a tiny bit soft. Magnus gets d5 in one go. If he goes rook a7 here, he takes advantage of that open a file, stops d5, because then after this one you're dropping this pawn, and okay, Magnus can go c6 here, but then queen e2, preparing to double the rooks. Slightly better for white, this was the way to go. But queen e2 played, allows d5 in one go, and now again Fabi goes wrong, he takes here, queen recaptures, goes queen e4, and he's just given away his advantage basically. It's an equal position, Magnus changes the queens, and this is the first turning point that I was talking about. So how would you recapture this queen here? What's the right way to go? Fabi gets it wrong. So the move to play here is rook takes on e4. And the reason being that after rook c6, which Magnus played, hitting this pawn, Yes, you go c3, but in this line you get better pressure against this e-pawn. So say Magnus protects with f6, well now you can go d4. Great breaking move. And there's no f5, by the way, preparing e4, picking up the tempo, because then you've got this nice tactical shot. If takes, white is better here. So this was the way to go. You take with the rook, and then you should be able to get d4. Decent game for white, still roughly level, but better. But Fabi takes with the pawn, and now after rook c6, pawn c3, things are just a bit uncomfortable for white. If we compare the pieces here, this rook's a bit passive, staring at its own pawn. This bishop staring at its own pawn. This one's more active. This rook's more active here, etc. Small edge for black. So we see pawn f6 from Magnus. Protects this one, prepares to remaneuver the knight. And now g3 from Fabi gives his king some room. We see pawn b4 from Magnus, king g2, an exchange here, bishop recaptures, and now Magnus could have gone bishop to b4 in one go here with advantage, but he goes bishop d6 first. This is blitz, they're making quick decisions, and now Fabi goes knight d2, improving his worst piece. Now we see Magnus doing the same with his knight. So he's got this kind of journey in mind into d4, and Fabi goes knight f1 because he's got this kind of journey in mind going to d5. And so Magnus now has to react, which he recognizes. He now goes bishop to b4. So we see the rook coming across, bishops exchange, rook recaptures, rook takes, pawn takes. And now this is what's so nice for Magnus. He just probes this endgame. He goes rook b3, rook c1 defends passively, and now this knight hops to e6, and it actually prevents this knight from coming to e3, or at least it gets very uncomfortable, because now after knight c5, how are you actually defending this pawn? If you go king f3, really natural looking move. The problem is knight d3, and it's really uncomfortable because you want to go here, stay with the pawn, but then you run into this check. This is a recurring theme. And so if we run back here, what if you instead defend with the f pawn? Still you've got knight d3, rook c2, same check, picking up the rook, the king's still misfortunately placed. And so this is the big problem with this whole line, going knight to e3, and that's why knight d2 played. Rook b2 now from Magnus, he pressures that knight, and you don't want to go passive, then the rook comes here, everything's tied down, horrible for white, so knight c4 was played instead, hits this rook, and Fabi goes active with rook to d1. Great policy, he's going for counterplay, but look at the clock times, he's really getting down now. Knight c5 from Magnus, hits this pawn, and now again there's problems defending. You can't go f3, this one's pinned. If you go with the king, well then there's rook c2 hitting this one, and so this is why Fabi, he goes active now, best policy. He first blocks with the rook like this, saying please take me, I'll take back with the knight, defend the pawn, but after Magnus goes rook a4, hits this knight, he retreats it, then drops the pawn, but then gets the rook active, going after the c-pawn. And now Magnus goes rook a2, good move, hitting this one with two pieces. So here we see the king slithering out of its hole, very important concept, you don't want to get boxed in there. And now Magnus goes slightly wrong here. So it's very, very tricky, but basically white's threat here is to go knight f5 and then start putting a lot of problems around the black king. And so you should check like this. This is the top way to play in the computer's mind. King drops, knight e6 covers these points, and if you attack the knight, well then rook a6 just holds it together. I mean, some pretty deep stuff here. But Magnus instead takes the pawn, more natural idea in blitz, but it allows this knight f5, Magnus takes another one, and now Fabi goes with check. And this is the second turning point. When Magnus allows this whole idea of knight f5 and so on, Fabi is now equalizing. King f8, he takes another pawn, Magnus saves this one, but king e3 just waits on the position, and although Fabi's a pawn down, because his knight is so dominant, this should be drawing. Knight g5 from Magnus, knight d6 just waits, Magnus goes rook c2, the knight hops back, and now knight e6 hits the rook, it comes here, attacks the knight, Magnus defends like this, but now is this a draw? Well, Fabi checks, and it looks like this is just headed for a perpetual, because king e7 comes back to hold the knight, right? That's what's expected Magnus would play. Then you check, king comes back, check again, king stays with the knight. But this is the beautiful thing. When you get this check here, Magnus doesn't stay with the knight, he goes king to g6. This is the third key turning point of the game, because he gives an entire knight. Now what's his idea? Is he taking here, allowing white to take with check and going for this kind of drawn position? Well, no. After the knight is captured, he takes here with check, allows the king to hit that rook with tempo, but then comes back here. Such a beautiful idea, because the knight is actually trapped. Look at this pawn here, taking g4. Can't go anywhere. Now Fabi goes to play the right move, but then hesitates. He should go pawn g4 here. This is a way to try and hold the draw, because now if you go rook h8, which we see in the game, then there's different ways to draw actually. You can even take here with check, give the knight in a line like this, and although you're a pawn down, you should be able to hold this. The king comes in front, this one's cut. You can even exchange rooks and hold this pawn endgame. This is a sample drawing line, but Fabi doesn't go g4, he misses that one. He instead goes king e3, now rook h8, and it's all over. Now it's showing here that Fabi lost in this position, but actually if you watch the replay, he does play g4 here. Magnus simply takes the knight and then he resigns. This is hopeless, because after say takes with check, rook recaptures, you're just 2 pawns down, completely lost endgame. So stunning game from Magnus, and if you want to see another incredible chess domination, then check out this video on screen. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.